Good morning. Welcome back, everybody, to another video. This one's going to look at the process of globalization and the interconnection of the world through trade since the end of World War II. So the place we're actually going to start here is in Europe, because of course Europe was one of the early leaders in this process of globalization. And before we get too far into this, of course, if you like this video, make sure you slam the like button. To get notifications on the new videos, make sure you subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions, if you have any comments, whatever you'd like to tell me, go ahead and leave those in the comments. You can also leave things on Google Classroom or shoot me an email anytime. So let's jump back in here, and we're going to look at first Europe in the process of globalization. So the place where this really started was in 1951. After World War II, Europe was, of course, completely and totally smashed by the war itself. And so the countries of Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany, of course, because it was the Cold War, so we still had a West Germany, got together in 1951 and they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris was a big deal because what it did was it created an organization called the European Coal and Steel Community. 6 European countries that came together to work cooperatively to regulate the industrial production of coal and steel by combining their efforts together and then trading with each other under common terms. So basically what this was 6 different countries came together and said, we're going to try to unify our coal and steel production. And ultimately what they found out was that was actually really good for them. They could produce more, they could get more money for their efforts, and ultimately they could economically benefit by working collaboratively together as the European coal and steel community. Now, in 1957, they decided to make this an even larger program where it wasn't just going to be about the regulation of coal and steel. In 1957, they signed a new treaty, which was called the Treaty of Rome. And what that did is it created what was called the European Economic Community, as well as another organization called the European Atomic Energy Community. But we're going to focus more on the European Economic Community. And essentially what this did was it said, we're going to start lowering the trade barriers between all of these different countries. So we're going to remove things like taxation. We're going to remove things like importation tax. We're going to allow products to move back and forth across the European continent without necessarily having to recognize that they've crossed a border. We want a free trade region here. And in 1957, the European Treaty of Rome allowed and facilitated that process to take place. Now, in 2002, the Treaty of Paris expired, and so what happened was they actually signed a new treaty in which the nations of Europe have unified together now as what we call the European Union. The European Union looked at the situation with the European Economic Community and said, listen, it's great that we've unified the economies. It's great that we've unified the currency of all of these countries. However, one of the problems we get is we still have lots and lots of different countries, and those different countries can make different rules about how to operate, even though they've agreed to work with the European Economic Community. And so it would be great if we could have more political unification to get all of these different countries on the same page and working together. That process was undertaken by what was called the Maastricht Treaty of 1993. Well, it came into force in 1993. The Maastricht Treaty essentially said that each country in Europe was going to become almost like a state in a larger country of the European Union. Now, what that means then is that the European Union has to make some decisions that everybody else inside of the European Union has to deal with and has to live with. Some of those decisions were things like borders now inside the European Union don't exist. A person can walk from Lisbon, Portugal to Tallinn, Estonia, and never have to show a passport, never have to be asked why they're crossing that border. You can live in any country in the European Union, you can work in any other country in the European Union, and you can retire in any other country in the European Union. They all use the exact same currency. They all have the exact same terms of trade. They all have the same taxation policy. Everything is identical. Europe has become not only one economy, but also the force that's taken control here is they're becoming basically one country. In the past 3 years, since 2007, they've already talked about creating a unified military force. So really, one of the major forces in Europe today is what we refer to as the process of integration or unification. Making Europe, the European Union project is creating a what we call a supranational country, where the different nations, right, it's going to become a multi-ethnic nation where all the different nations of Europe come together as one unified country. Now, this hasn't been enormously popular with everyone, however, and the other force that we see in Europe, and particularly when we see this with the situation going on in 2020, one of the things that's been creeping into this European Union and really threatening its continued existence is nationalism. There are people in places like the United Kingdom and Hungary and Poland that say, but wait a minute, we like being Polish. We like making our own decisions as Polish people for Polish people. What happens if we disagree with Brussels, which is where the government of the European Union is headquarters? What happens if people in Warsaw disagree with people in Brussels? A lot of people inside of Poland say, well, the Polish government should still be able to do what it wants to. We should still have what is called national sovereignty. We should be allowed to make decisions for ourselves. Now, people who think like that, nationalists, they look at a process like the formation of the European Union and they say, this really isn't natural. This really isn't going to work. We really don't agree with everything that the European Union is going to do. We don't like the fact that people who make decisions for us in Brussels aren't elected by us. It's not a democratic system. The countries get to choose representatives to go to the European Parliament, but the people who are actually running the government, making decisions, are not accountable to the people, the actual people of Europe in and of itself. It's not a popular election system. Because of that, of course, the first group that really started to push for independence from the European Union was the British and the United Kingdom. The British really, because they're an island, they've always maintained themselves as separate, and they've maintained themselves as different. And so one of the things they didn't do is they never formally adopted the European currency, the euro. In June of 2016, the Europeans held a national referendum, which means they went directly to the people of the United Kingdom to ask them, in or out, do you want to remain a member of the European Union or not? And everybody knew what was going to happen in this election, and they knew that everybody in the United Kingdom, and that most people in the United Kingdom wanted to stay part of the European Union. So they said, well, we'll just hold a vote, and when the European Union membership wins the vote, everything will be great. The problem is, in June of 2016, in a vote of 52% to 48%, the British people outside of the big cities voted to leave the European Union, starting a process that we now refer to as Brexit. In March of 2017, the United Kingdom's government formally started the process of leaving the European Union, which is called invoking Article 50. And ultimately what we've seen is this process has been ongoing. On October the 17th of 2019, the British government formally agreed to a withdrawal agreement, and then they held a new election inside of the United Kingdom. And in that United Kingdom election, the Conservatives, who are the party that's really promoting and advocating for Brexit, won a humongous majority, one of the largest majorities in the entire history of Parliament. Once they won that election in December of 2019, they could then elect, having the prime minister, they could then make a decision about whatever they wanted to do, basically. Whatever Boris Johnson, the prime minister of Great Britain, decides, and the United Kingdom decides, that can pretty much automatically pass through Parliament because they've got this huge majority. The withdrawal agreement that they'd passed was ratified by Parliament on the 23rd of January in 2020 and came into force on the 31st of January 2020. So since January 31st of 2020, the United Kingdom is no longer a member of the European Union. They have formally left. Now, one of the things we see is that other countries inside of the European Union watch that process very, very closely. There are people inside of Poland that really would like independence. There are people inside of Hungary that would really like independence. The Hungarians especially are fiercely nationalistic, and they would very much like to not be part of this supranational multi-ethnic state of the European Union. Now, when we see the current crisis and the current health crisis going on inside of the European Union, one of the things we've seen is countries snatched up things like PPE, right? Personal protective equipment, masks and gloves and gowns. Those countries snatched it up and didn't necessarily allow Brussels to run the show and didn't necessarily allow the European Union to control things from that very, very top level down. They said, listen, Italy needs gowns, Italy needs masks. Italy is taking these gowns and masks. We don't care if Brussels tells us to send them someplace else. Or Hungary decided that when Italy needed lots and lots of stuff, the government of Hungary said, hey, wait, we need stuff too, and so we're not going to do what Brussels tells us. So the current crisis really has shown Europeans especially that nationalism is still a major thing. And so the question that we've got in the next 10 years is going to be, what's going to happen to the European Union? Is it going to continue? Is it going to continue unity? Is it going to continue integrating more and more? Or is it going to split up and go back to being basically the Westphalian system of separate nation states? And of course, at this point, I can't tell you because we're all living in the world together, and I'm a historian, not a futurist, so I can't tell you what it's going to be like. But ultimately, that's the big question. The two forces of integration and separation, or nationalism, are the future, and one of them's going to win and one of them's going to lose, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that comes out. Now, the second key point to this second part of this section is one of the really interesting things as part of this process of integration of Europe has been a general trend in the world towards what we call globalization. Globalization is when different economies in the world specialize themselves in the production of different kinds of products, and then ultimately what they do is they trade with each other. So a country, for example, like China, that's really, really, really good at industrial manufacturing because they've got lots and lots of very, very cheap labor, they tend to focus themselves on producing things that require lots of manual labor in factories, but they don't necessarily focus themselves in on things that require lots and lots of high technology. A country like the United States that has lots and lots of capital resources and lots of technology, we focus on high tech things and then let the Chinese manufacture it, and then we trade back and forth. We trade high-tech things to them. They trade, cheaply made manufactured products back to us. And the thought process behind this was it would allow us both to become interdependent, which means we depend on each other for our very survival so that it prevents war from ever happening, right? If we produce the food and they produce the manufactured products and then we trade, well, we can't live without manufactured products and they can't live without food. So, and again, that's a very simplified version of this, but when we depend on each other, what that does is it prevents us from going to war. And so globalists really look at this process of globalization as a good thing and as a process by which the world can achieve peace, a lasting peace in the future. It really is idealism, where we can solve the problems of conflict by creating global interdependence. Now, of course, the European Union is definitely a major feature of this, right? The globalists love the European Union, and the European Union is absolutely a globalist project. But, of course, one of the things we see is nationalism does continue to crop up. If we look at the current health crisis that we've got, one of the things the Chinese government did as soon as they realized there was going to be a global pandemic is they started snatching up masks and gowns and gloves and personal protective equipment that they manufactured for somebody, another country, and then they refused to export it. The government nationalized it and claimed it for their own because they knew that they were going to use it. Well, that's pure nationalism. Even in a communist country, you still get nationalism. So, globalism it's an interesting idea that might work or it might not work, and we just have to see. But definitely one of the consequences of it is something which we've seen, which is very different than what we've been talking about since the very beginning of our class in January. Since January, we've been talking about a world which has really revolved around changes in Europe. Europe has been a driving force behind things like the Age of Exploration and the Age of the Enlightenment. And those were the trendsetters, right? Europe was the trendsetter. They had the money, they had the Industrial Revolution, and so everybody else looked to them for guidance and for cultural leadership. After World War II, one of the things we see is that Europe was broke. And because Europe was broke, cultural attention and political attention shifted away from Europe and towards the United States. And of course, during the Cold War, the United States was super powerful and important, and we ran NATO. And of course, that gave us a lot of political control and authority. But also what we have to realize is when things started to shift away from Europe and then globalization took over, a lot of that wealth and a lot of that power has been shifting from the United States to what we call the Pacific Rim. We went from a world that was dominated by the Atlantic trade network to a world that's been really much more focused on the Pacific Rim, the area surrounding the Pacific Ocean. And the reason for that is the rise of Asia and the rise of Asian economies. And of course, we have to talk about a couple of these. Of course, China is important when it comes to things like low-end manufacturing, things like that. But really, the real drivers of this Asian economy are what we call the four Asian tigers. These are countries which are extremely capitalistic. They're also very wealthy. They focused a lot on the manufacturing of consumer products. And so the four Asian tigers that we talk about are some of the freest economies in the entire world. They grow massively. They're super, super powerful. They're very, very wealthy. And of course, these four countries are Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore. And really the world's attention has been shifting to those in addition to China and Japan. But of course, the four Asian tigers are still developing countries that are getting to be very, very, very powerful and dominant. And whether or not they will continue throughout the 21st century to expand their economic influence and continue to dominate things like production markets, particularly when you look at what's happened in 2020. When it comes to what's happened in 2020, a lot of people now are very reticent to continue doing business with China because we see, what the communist system of China has produced, not only for them, but also for the rest of the world. A problem that we see, or some situations that we see revolving around globalism, as the world's economy has gotten more and more interconnected, we've also seen some unintended consequences, or what the economists call externalities. One of these is, after World War II in the United States, of course, the United States was a major industrial producer. We had humongous amounts of factory jobs and production capacity, and we really were the economic engine of the world. However, as that happened, prices for things like American labor went up, right? People made more money and they expected to live a middle-class lifestyle, and that's very, very expensive. When countries had the opportunity to trade freely with other countries, so for example, in 1994, President Clinton signed a permanent trade agreement with China so that any products coming out of China were able to be freely sold in the United States. Well, when you've got an American product made by American workers, it's got to be very expensive compared to a product made in China by Chinese workers. So they have a natural advantage when it comes to manufactured products. As a result of that, one of the things that companies did was they closed down American factories and they moved those factories to China or Vietnam or any other kind of low-cost production facility, which really started to cost Americans large numbers of jobs. This process is called outsourcing. And of course, living in Northern Ohio, like most of my students and most of my viewers do, we understand the consequences of this. If you drive through a place like Cleveland, Ohio, or Lorain, Ohio, you can definitely see the consequences of outsourcing of jobs, which of course is a byproduct of globalization. In addition to outsourcing and the problems that that produces, we also see another unintended consequence, which is the birth of a new style of economics, which is what we call the MNC, Multinational Corporations. Because globalization interconnects humongous economies across the whole world, companies that really participate and take advantage in those have also become enormously huge and powerful. Here we're looking at a chart which really shows and explores multinational corporations in the food and consumer products part of the economy. And so here what you can see is really there's only a handful of companies, but they control an enormous quantity of what products people produce. And really there are companies now that don't produce anything anymore. All they do is they buy and sell and they own other companies. So just to point out a couple of really kind of interesting and strange examples that this multinational corporation organization system produces, if we look down there at a company which is called P&G, Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble owns a huge amount of other companies, and brands as well, right? So they own Tide. They also own Gain. They also own Joy and Ivory and Downy and Cascade. So if you're buying dish soap or if you're buying soap of any kind, pretty much you're buying a Procter & Gamble product. One of the consequences of this multinational corporations and again owning lots and lots of different companies and lots of different brands is if you look under PG&E, they also own two brands which you wouldn't expect to be owned and controlled by the same company because of how they're marketed. Old Spice, of course, is marketed as products for men, which is a very manly brand, and it's something that they understand men, and we have a deep connection to men as the Old Spice brand. However, right below that, if you'll notice, P&G, Procter & Gamble, also owns Tampax and Pampers. Right, so when they promote this kind of brand awareness of we are a manly company that understands manly things, but the exact same company is also producing baby diapers and Tampax. A lot of that marketing is an illusion to ultimately allow this huge multinational corporation to convince people to buy their products. And of course, it's absolutely enormous. So I would encourage you to spend some time going through this and just see how many different products that you buy are all owned by the exact same company. That gives these companies a huge amount of power and an enormous amount of control. So that's where we're going to leave it for globalization and trade. I hope this video was good for you. Again, if you liked it, leave a like. If you want notifications for the new videos, hit subscribe, hit the bell icon. Feel free to leave comments and questions down below, or get your comments and questions to me any other way that you have access to and know how to. I will see you guys in the next video when we talk about some social and environmental issues going on in the world today. I hope everybody is staying healthy. I hope everybody is staying safe, and I will see you in the next video.